It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop. A dusty road, a beat-up motorcycle, and a lone rider in dark goggles who didn't flinch when the sirens wailed behind him. The state troopers thought they were dealing with a burnout drifter, some ex-vat who'd lost his grip on life and wandered too close to the wrong checkpoint. But what they didn't know was that the man they'd pulled over hadn't just come from the desert. He had walked out of a classified black site halfway across the globe. And he wasn't alone for long. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun set low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert highway just outside of Redcliff, Arizona, a nowhere town famous only for its proximity to absolutely nothing. Sheriff Rourke had just returned from a dry morning briefing, where the biggest topic of the day was a vending machine theft at a local high school. Boredom was his companion and routine was his religion. That's why, when the 911 dispatch radio crackled with a notice of a suspicious motorcycle headed eastbound on Route 86, traveling alone at high speed and refusing to stop for an earlier patrol unit, Rourke jumped at the chance for some action. The bike had slipped through the fingers of a couple of rookies near the county line, but now it was his turn. He grabbed Deputy Jensen, a kid just 3 months on the job, and rolled out with tires spitting dust behind them. The rider in question wore a weathered black jacket, the kind you'd find at a military surplus store, stained with sun and sweat, with a faded insignia that had been intentionally scrubbed away. His helmet visor was opaque, giving no hint of the eyes beneath, and his build was average at first glance, not bulky, not particularly tall, but every movement he made was unnervingly efficient, fluid in the way only a trained body learns to be. The motorcycle itself was a relic, a restored M72 with a sidecar, Soviet era, a machine that had no business on American roads, let alone tearing across the Arizona flats at 90 miles per hour. It screamed eccentricity. To the law enforcement on duty that day, it screamed trouble. As the sheriff and his deputy got within visual range, they were puzzled to see the rider pulled over voluntarily, parked beside a battered rest stop bench. No resistance, no chase, no drama. He stood beside the motorcycle like he had been waiting for them the entire time. Rourke's cruiser pulled in with a crunch of gravel, and Jensen's fingers twitched nervously near his holster. The man didn't move, not even when Rourke barked the first warning. No ID, no license plate, no registration. When asked his name, he simply replied, "Call me Cal." Rourke didn't like mysteries, and he especially didn't like men who looked him in the eye like they had already sized him up and dismissed him. Cal was cooperative, too cooperative. His voice was calm, emotionless, like he'd practiced being unmemorable. But Rourke had been on the job long enough to know that when someone tries too hard to disappear, there's something they don't want you to see. Deputy Jensen asked to search the sidecar, and without a word, Cal stepped aside. Inside, they found a bundle of gear so neatly packed it looked military-issued. Spare clothing, MREs, a rolled-up map with routes drawn in pencil, and most alarming of all, a heavily modified satellite phone with no manufacturer markings. The troopers glanced at each other. That wasn't standard backpacker tech, not even close. While they radioed in for federal support, a subtle shift in Cal's posture occurred. He no longer looked like a drifter. He stood straighter, eyes flicking to the horizon, listening, calculating. Behind the lenses of his goggles, he tracked something only he could sense. Seconds stretched. The sheriff was still on the radio when a gust of hot desert wind swept over the rest stop, carrying with it a low, unfamiliar thrum, a sound that didn't belong in the empty expanse of Route 86. Then came the unmarked SUV. It roared in from the west like it had been launched from a railgun. Blacked-out windows, no plates, moving with the urgency of an extraction mission. Rourke's hand instinctively went to his weapon, but Cal stepped forward and raised one hand. The SUV stopped a dozen feet away. The back door swung open. No one stepped out, but the message was clear. This wasn't a pickup. This was a call. Before the sheriff could process what was happening, Cal turned back to him. "You need to forget you saw me, and you need to leave this area, now." It was a direct order, not a plea, not a request. Something in Rourke's spine tightened. Jensen muttered, "Who the hell is this guy?" But Cal was already walking toward the vehicle. And that's when the backseat passenger leaned forward. A man with a Delta Force insignia tattooed on his wrist, partially hidden by a matte black tactical glove. He met Rourke's eyes across the distance. No words, just a look. The kind of look that said, "You're in the wrong place," asking the wrong questions. The SUV peeled off without a sound, leaving nothing behind but dust and an uneasy silence. Sheriff Rourke stared down the empty highway long after the vehicle disappeared. The only proof that any of it had happened was the scuffed tire marks in the gravel and a single patch of flattened earth where Cal had stood. In his decades on the force, he had never once been told to stand down by someone who wasn't officially above him. But something in that moment, in that vehicle, in that insignia, made his gut twist. He didn't know who he had just let walk away, but he knew one thing for certain. He had stopped the wrong motorcycle. And now, the entire balance of power in Redcliff was about to shift. Sheriff Rourke didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office long after the station lights were dimmed, staring at the tire tracks Jensen had photographed with his department-issue Canon. The photos lay scattered across his desk, along with a printout of the vehicle registration report that came back blank, and a sketch of the map they had recovered from the sidecar before it mysteriously disappeared. One moment it had been sitting in the evidence locker, the next it was gone without a trace. The logbook unsigned, no camera footage showing the break-in. It was as if Cal had reached through time and erased his own footprints. And Rourke hated not having answers. By morning, he did what he rarely ever did. He called into Phoenix. He didn't bother with the usual liaison line. He went straight to Major Helena Draper with the Arizona Fusion Center, someone he'd worked with back in the early 2000s during a domestic terror investigation that barely made the news. Draper listened to his account with practiced disinterest, and when he got to the part about the Delta Force insignia, she cut him off with a long, tired sigh. She told him to let it go. The case was outside his jurisdiction now. If she sounded almost annoyed, it wasn't because she didn't believe him. It was because she knew exactly who he was talking about and didn't want to explain further. She used terms like classified asset monitoring and non-civilian interference protocols. But Rourke was no new to government obfuscation. What she really meant was, stay out of it or you'll regret it. Deputy Jensen, still green and full of bravado, didn't take kindly to the dismissal. He wanted to follow up, pull security footage from local gas stations, cross-check motel guest logs for anyone matching Cal's description. Rourke shut him down with a cold warning, let this one go. But the kid didn't listen. 2 days later, he disappeared from his apartment. No signs of struggle, nothing stolen, just gone. His cruiser was found at the station, his badge still in the passenger seat. Rourke didn't need to be told it was a message. As word of the strange traffic stop leaked among the department staff, rumors began to swell like desert thunderstorms. One dispatcher swore she had seen the SUV again, parked at the edge of a canyon outlook 2 towns over. A highway patrolman claimed his dash cam stopped recording for 30 minutes while shadowing a similar motorcycle in the same general area. The reports were disjointed and inconsistent, but one thing was clear. No one in official channels wanted to deal with it. When Rourke sent in a request for support through Homeland Security, it was returned within the hour with a generic, no further investigation necessary stamp. A week later, he received an audit letter targeting his department's finances. Coincidence or punishment, he didn't know, but he knew fear when he saw it. In Washington, Cal's name, or rather the code name associated with him, appeared on encrypted networks only accessible by the highest echelon of defense contractors and special operations liaisons. He was known in some files as Nomad, in others as Asset K22, a man who wasn't officially alive, but whose body count in the field had triggered multiple internal reviews regarding engagement ethics and international treaties. To the Pentagon, he was both an embarrassment and a necessity, the kind of operator they couldn't publicly acknowledge, but couldn't afford to lose. None of this, of course, filtered down to the rank and file in Redcliff.
All they saw was the aftermath. More patrols were pulled from the outer perimeter, fewer calls were answered, and every so often one of the senior deputies would quietly resign or request a transfer. Rourke noticed that the further someone probed into the incident, the quicker they vanished from the department or the town itself. It was psychological warfare, not bullets and blood, but intimidation and attrition. And it worked. The townspeople had their own version of the story by now. They spoke of a biker ghost who had escaped from a military prison, a government assassin gone rogue, or some kind of test subject from an illegal black ops program. One bartender swore up and down that the man had come into his place for water and left a 50 on the counter with a burn mark across it, like it had been yanked from an explosion. Another local said he saw Cal patch up a wild dog with a combat medkit and speak softly to it in what sounded like Arabic. The stories spiraled, blending truth with fantasy, but one detail stayed constant. He had looked ordinary, just a man on a motorcycle, until he wasn't. Meanwhile, Cal kept moving. He passed through ghost towns, old mining settlements swallowed by dust, and always stayed one step ahead of any curious eyes. He avoided technology when he could, burned through multiple prepaid phones, and never stayed more than a few hours in any given place. But every so often, he'd send out a signal, a small encrypted burst, barely detectable to anyone except those who knew what to look for. A signal that Delta Force picked up immediately. What they didn't realize was that Cal wasn't just sending messages. He was tracking something. Someone.
A threat that hadn't yet surfaced in the United States, not directly, but was growing in the shadows of its own borders. The real reason for his presence was still unknown, even to those who once commanded him. But it would soon become impossible to ignore. Back in Redcliff, Sheriff Rourke sat in his cruiser late one night, watching the empty stretch of Route 86. He held a manila folder in his lap with the last known coordinates from a former military satellite tech who owed him a favor. The data showed a loop, a return path. Cal was coming back. And next time, he wouldn't be alone. The desert has a way of remembering things people forget. Tracks in the sand, faint burns on old concrete, the hum of distant turbines when there shouldn't be any. A week after the SUV vanished with Cal, the rest stop at Route 86 fell quiet again, but the silence was laced with tension. The scrub brush whispered in the wind like it was passing rumors to the mesquite trees. Something was coming. Sheriff Rourke didn't need confirmation. He felt it in his bones every time he looked out at that stretch of road, like a coil winding tighter. 3 nights after Deputy Jensen disappeared, a motorist passing through town reported something strange. Her name was Marla Beaudry, a nurse from Sierra Verde returning home from a night shift. She pulled into the local diner to grab a coffee and told the waitress that about 12 miles out, she had seen a dark figure crouched behind a broken billboard, completely still. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see anyone, let alone someone watching the road in the middle of the night. She thought it might have been an animal until she caught a glint of metal and realized the shape was too symmetrical, too human. She kept driving, but her hands trembled the rest of the way home. The waitress told Rourke the next morning, almost as an afterthought, but he took it seriously. He drove out himself, didn't even bring backup. When he reached the billboard, he saw the faint remains of pressure marks on the dirt, a man's boot tread, deep and wide, but only one set, and next to it an empty blister pack from an Army-issue stimulant. The expiration date had been scratched off. Back at the station, Rourke pulled out the drawer with the confiscated gear they hadn't turned over to Phoenix. Most of it had already vanished, likely removed by someone higher up, but he still had Cal's canteen, a dented titanium model with a nameplate so worn it was unreadable. He held it for a long time, then noticed something new. Inside the threading of the cap, tucked neatly into the groove, was a strip of reflective tape no bigger than a matchstick. To anyone else, it was nothing. But Rourke had been through enough tactical briefings in his younger days to recognize the tell. It was a tracking countermeasure. Not for him, for whoever was watching Cal. It dawned on him then that Cal hadn't just been evading people,
He had been studying them. He hadn't run at the rest stop out of fear. He had stopped on purpose, measured the response time of local law enforcement, observed the strength of their reactions. His actions hadn't been accidental, they'd been diagnostic. Rourke realized with a cold shudder that his entire department had been field tested like a security drill. Meanwhile, sightings began trickling in from the surrounding towns. A fuel station manager near Whiskey Hollow found that one of his locked diesel pumps had been used overnight, despite no logs, and there was a perfect print of military-grade combat boots near the outlet. A retired trucker swore he saw the same beat-up motorcycle parked under an abandoned radio tower outside Mesilla, with a man scaling the scaffolding at dawn using a rope harness and no safety gear. When he got closer, the man was gone, leaving only a spent MRE pouch and a folded slip of paper bearing a cryptic map of local relay stations. Most wrote these stories off as coincidence or hallucination. Rourke didn't. He started to dig. He kept it low level, asking favors through old friends in intelligence circles, trading bottles of rare bourbon and ancient favors for scraps of data. The fragments painted a blurred picture. Nomad had once led a ghost team in a country never officially declared a war zone. He had operated under a directive that no longer existed, managed by a commander whose records were wiped after an off-the-books operation went sideways. Most accounts suggested Cal was either dead or permanently off-grid, and those who said otherwise didn't say much at all. Rourke finally reached a man he hadn't spoken to in years, a grizzled former contractor who now lived in a gated compound in Idaho. The man didn't say Cal's name, he only asked one question: has he started building? At first, Rourke didn't understand, but then he remembered something odd that came up during the department's property audits. In the last 10 days, several small plots of land outside Redcliff had been bought up anonymously, all through shell companies with no clear ties. Each property had one thing in common: an elevated line of sight to the highway and access to natural rock formations ideal for concealment. Rourke visited one under the guise of a routine zoning inquiry and found, buried beneath the brush, a collapsed entry point that led to what appeared to be a half-constructed dugout. Not quite a bunker, but not a camp either. More like an observation post. Clean, precise, not recent, but definitely maintained. And there, on the edge of the wall, was a scrap of camo netting bearing the same faded military pattern as Cal's jacket.
He began to see the pattern. Cal wasn't hiding. He was watching, preparing, mapping escape routes, securing fallback positions, monitoring the movement of whoever or whatever was coming next. Each encounter with local law enforcement, every supply point he hit, was part of a carefully choreographed system. He was playing a long game, and no one else even knew they were on the board. Then, late one night, the sheriff returned to his office to find a folded note on his desk. No one had entered, no windows broken, no alarms triggered. Just the note. Inside, it read, "When the convoy comes, don't follow. Just observe. C." Rourke stared at the paper for a long time, knowing that everything he'd learned so far was just the beginning. This wasn't a drifter or an ex-soldier on the run. This was an operator conducting reconnaissance in his own country, and the real threat hadn't arrived yet. The day the convoy arrived, the heat had taken on a strange edge, as if the sun itself knew something unnatural was about to crawl across the horizon. The citizens of Redcliff, few as they were, went about their daily routines with the sluggish gait of people who had spent too long living in the comfort of insignificance. It was the kind of place that time skimmed over, where nothing ever happened and no one ever came. But by noon, that illusion began to fray, and by dusk it had been ripped clean away. Sheriff Rourke was already on edge that morning. The note left in his office had been tucked away in a file folder beneath the seat of his cruiser, but it burned in his thoughts like a live ember. When the convoy comes, don't follow, just observe. It wasn't a warning, it was a command.
and Rourke knew better than to treat it lightly. The precision of Cal's movements up to this point, his restraint, his insight, his calm, was not the work of someone reacting to the world. It was the work of someone shaping it. Whoever he was, whatever he had been trained to do, Cal had begun preparing for something Redcliff wasn't ready to face. At 1:42 p.m., the first vehicle rolled through the west edge of town, a matte black Suburban with tinted windows and military-grade suspension, followed by another and another, a total of 6 in formation. No plates, no markings, just cold, engineered uniformity. They didn't stop, they didn't even slow down. They passed the sheriff's office like it wasn't there, heading east down Route 86 with the kind of aggressive certainty that announced itself as not needing permission. Rourke radioed the station, telling Deputy Monroe to lock down civilian traffic and keep the chatter light. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. Monroe had seen enough since Cal's first appearance to know that silence was sometimes the best defense. The town's few traffic cameras, cheap solar-powered units mounted on leaning poles, blinked out within minutes. Not flickered, cut. Someone had shut them down remotely with surgical precision, blacking out the visual trail of the convoy as it moved deeper into the desert. The vehicles left no digital trace. It was as if they had never passed through. But Rourke saw them. He had parked his cruiser at the side of the highway just outside of town, at the bend where the road dipped toward the lower flats. From that vantage point, he had a clear view of the approaching line. As they passed, he noted the subtle details, reinforced panels behind the rear doors, slits for antennae usually hidden beneath civilian shells, and slight elevation adjustments that hinted at run-flat armor. These weren't just tactical SUVs. These were mobile command units, and they were headed directly toward the old Red Rock Basin where the signal towers used to stand, land recently bought by shell companies. By 3 p.m., the last Suburban had vanished into the canyon pass. Rourke waited until the dust settled before starting his engine. He didn't follow directly, remembering Cal's note. Instead, he circled north, using the old mining trail that snaked behind the basin. It took longer and tested the limits of his aging suspension, but it gave him a side view of the basin's inner mouth. What he saw when he reached the overlook made his chest tighten. They weren't there to investigate. They were there to dig in. The 6 vehicles had formed a perimeter near the base of the ridge. Men in desert camouflage uniforms moved in perfect sync, offloading crates marked with unidentifiable codes and deploying high-frequency scanners. Portable towers were already up, thin, skeletal structures with dishes that pointed to nothing on the visible spectrum. This wasn't a raid or an escort mission. This was an installation. Temporary, yes, but organized and prepared with chilling efficiency. They were setting up a listening post or, worse, something more surgical, more invasive. Surveillance, tracking, targeting. The kind of tech used overseas in war zones, now being quietly deployed in the Arizona desert. Rourke pulled out his camera and took 3 photos. Then he paused. Something moved in the trees below, too fast to be wind. A flicker of black across the stone. He lowered the camera, scanned with his binoculars, and there he was. Cal! Not hiding, not running, walking with purpose along the ridge, watching the convoy from above. He was in a different jacket now, darker and cleaner, but still nondescript. He moved like he belonged there, like the desert had opened up and let him out of the rock itself. And then he stopped, turned, looked directly at Rourke's position. Even from that distance, the message was clear. You're too close. Rourke ducked. When he looked again, Cal was gone. Back in town, strange things were beginning to happen. Cell coverage dropped intermittently, not in patches, but in full blackout waves that lasted minutes at a time.
The gas station's credit card system went down and never came back. At the school, a teacher's smartboard began receiving interference, short bursts of audio in garbled languages that none of the kids could identify.
Monroe, now running solo dispatch, reported that 3 of the town's main phone lines had gone dead, not disconnected, but scrambled, as though rerouted through another grid. Then came the arrival of the drones. They weren't local. They weren't recreational. Sleek, black, with near-silent propulsion and a triangular shape more common to reconnaissance craft used by private military contractors. They hovered over the basin at dusk, scanning, emitting a low pulse that rattled windows across Redcliff. People noticed. Questions started. And when no one had answers, fear filled the vacuum. At midnight, Rourke returned to the station. The power was out, the generator hadn't kicked in, and sitting on the front steps, just outside the door, was a parcel. No label, just a canvas-wrapped package with a military tag stitched into the side. Inside, Rourke found a pair of encrypted comms units, 2 burner phones, a schematic of the canyon basin, and a single phrase scribbled on a torn field notebook page. "They're not here for me. They're here for what I found." The crisis had reached its tipping point. The town didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath them had just shifted. Forces far beyond their jurisdiction had converged, and if Cal was right, if what he'd found was really hidden in those red rocks, then this wasn't just about one man on a motorcycle anymore. It was about what he had stumbled onto. And who wanted it badly enough to send in a black budget unit to claim it, no matter the cost. The wind had picked up in Redcliff, that dry, hollow kind of wind that seemed to carry voices if you listened too long. By morning, the entire town felt like it was holding its breath. Everyone knew something was wrong. The air buzzed with an electricity no one could name, a sense that the world had tilted slightly on its axis. The tension wasn't just in the silence of the streets or the flickering streetlights. It was in the way people looked over their shoulders, in the questions they didn't ask at the diner, in the anxious glances exchanged at the hardware store when the satellite TV lost signal again. Even the dogs were quieter. Sheriff Rourke stood in front of his bathroom mirror, studying the reflection he no longer fully recognized. The face looking back was older, more worn, but there was something else, something awake behind the eyes. The kind of alertness he hadn't felt since his earliest years in the force, before the weight of bureaucratic routine dulled the edge. He splashed cold water on his face and reached for the small comms unit Cal had left him. He hadn't touched it yet, hadn't powered it on. Something in him had resisted the shift, the acknowledgement that he was no longer just a local sheriff, that something bigger had pulled him into its orbit. But the time for waiting had passed. He powered it on. There was no startup chime, no boot screen, just a soft click and a red LED. Static for a moment, then a voice. Flat, steady, unmistakably Cal. It wasn't live. It was pre-recorded. If you're hearing this, you're already compromised. Your town's on the perimeter of an active retrieval zone. You've seen the drones. You've seen the personnel. You're not the target. You're in the way. They won't tell you to move. They'll just make you disappear. That's protocol. Listen carefully. In the basin, 2 levels beneath the eastern rock face is a capsule. It's buried in the fault line. It doesn't belong to them. I found it first. They want it because it can't be copied. Not by them, not by anyone. I need your eyes, Sheriff. Nothing more. Just eyes. Don't engage. Don't alert. Watch the road. Watch the power lines. Watch for signals you've never seen before. You'll know when to move. You'll feel it. Trust that. Rourke stood frozen, the weight of those words anchoring him. A capsule buried in the fault line? What the hell had this man unearthed? More importantly, why was an elite black budget unit mobilized to recover it? The story had grown legs and started sprinting, and Rourke could barely keep up. Later that day, he changed uniforms. Not the brown and tan county issue. Something older. He went into his garage and pulled out the duffel he hadn't touched in over 20 years. Inside, his old Army Reserve gear, still folded, still smelling faintly of gun oil and sand. He strapped the sidearm he hadn't worn in a decade back onto his hip, not for show, not for swagger, but because something in him had turned. He had crossed the line between observer and operative, and there was no going back. He told no one. Not Monroe, not the dispatch team, not even his sister who lived 2 blocks down. Some things had to be done in silence. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the basin flared with unnatural light. Not bright, not blinding. Just wrong. A pulse of blue that shimmered along the ridgeline for a few seconds, then faded like it had never existed. Rourke saw it from the tower at the fire station, where he'd posted himself for overwatch. He lifted binoculars and scanned, but the equipment the convoy had erected had changed. Where there had been scanners, there were now shields. Where there had been tripods, there were mounted receivers. Someone had accelerated their timeline. Someone had gotten nervous. Then came the moment Rourke knew was inevitable. A familiar sound, low at first, then rising. A 2-stroke engine tearing through the dusk, cutting across the stillness like a blade.
The motorcycle, the same one from before, only now it wasn't hiding. It wasn't silent. It came down Main Street like it owned the town, moving fast but measured, with a confidence that stopped people in their tracks. Cal rode like a man who'd run out of reasons to avoid notice. He wasn't blending in anymore. He was announcing himself. Rourke watched from the fire tower as Cal parked in front of the courthouse. He dismounted, pulled off the helmet, and for the first time revealed his face. It was clean-shaven now, angular and lean, but unmistakably military. Scar over the eyebrow, faint lines from too many desert missions, eyes that looked like they hadn't truly slept in a decade. He didn't look at anyone. He walked up the steps and pushed through the courthouse doors like he had a key to the entire building coded into his blood. No one followed. No one questioned it. And in that moment, Rourke realized that the town had finally seen him for what he was. Not a drifter, not a burnout, not a threat. A weapon. Inside the courthouse, Cal made his way to the old records room. There, behind a loose panel in the wall, was the briefcase he had hidden days ago, when no one was looking, when all eyes were on the desert. Inside the case were schematics, hard drives, and a sealed envelope marked with an old Delta insignia. He opened it. Inside was a photo of a younger version of himself, standing next to a man Rourke recognized as Colonel Davis McLean, once believed dead in a helicopter crash overseas. On the back of the photo was a handwritten line, "The capsule is more than data. It remembers who touches it." Cal stared at it for a long moment, then packed it away. When he emerged from the courthouse, the wind had died. The town was still. No drones in sight, no convoy visible, just the waiting. The kind of stillness that comes right before a strike. And that night, Rourke knew the identity Cal had worn like armor, silent, unassuming, invisible, had cracked. The soldier had stepped forward. The ghost had materialized. He was no longer pretending to be something else. And whatever storm he had come to prepare for, it was nearly here. When the storm hit, it wasn't with thunder or rain. It came with silence first. Deep, devouring silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes your heartbeat sound like gunfire. Just after midnight, every light in Redcliff winked out. Street lamps, security systems, generators, phones, even battery-powered devices died, flickering one last time before collapsing into dead weight. The town disappeared from the grid in a single breath. It wasn't a power outage. It was an erasure. Rourke knew then that the countdown had ended. In the blackout, he stood at the rooftop of the fire station with the borrowed military binoculars Cal had left for him days before. They were old, scratched, and still carried the faint scent of desert oil, but they worked, and what he saw through them nearly stole the air from his lungs. The basin was lit with an unnatural glow, not the harsh halogen of construction lights, not the flicker of fire, but a cold, white radiance that pulsed like a heartbeat from deep beneath the rock. At the center of the canyon, the convoy had transformed. The SUVs were no longer vehicles. They had unfolded, split open, and reconfigured into modular stations, antenna deployed, dishes spinning, rods burrowing into the earth.
Military tents had been erected in perfect formation, and soldiers, if that's what they were, moved in squads with movements too synchronized to be normal. No casual gestures, no talking, just perfect mechanical precision. These weren't National Guard, these weren't even regular special forces. Rourke had seen enough combat drills in his life to recognize when something was human. And whatever these men were, they didn't behave like soldiers. They moved like algorithms. That's when he saw Cal. He didn't appear from the shadows this time. He walked down the open road from the ridge above, full profile against the wash of moonlight. He was dressed differently now. Tactical gear worn over his black jacket, no longer trying to hide his weapons. Rifle slung across his back, sidearm holstered, night vision flipped up but ready. He moved like someone not afraid to be seen. No more blending in. He stepped directly into the basin as the lights brightened, as the sensors swept across him, and he didn't flinch when the first 3 soldiers raised their weapons. They didn't shoot. They hesitated. And in that hesitation, something snapped into place. One of them stepped forward. Larger than the rest, face obscured beneath a matte helmet with no insignia, no visor slit, just a reflective surface where a face should be. Rourke watched through the lens as the figure raised one gloved hand and pointed directly at Cal. A command, perhaps. Or a warning. Cal answered by kneeling, slowly, deliberately, and placing his hands behind his head. That was the moment Rourke knew something was wrong. Because Cal wasn't surrendering, he was stalling. The men approached, 5 of them, then 6. A 7th hung back near one of the equipment towers, adjusting something on a touchscreen. Rourke shifted focus and saw that they were uploading, transferring data, fast, gigabytes per second, to an orbital satellite, to a black site off the books. It didn't matter. What mattered was the red line on the monitor. It was already past 60%. And that's when the explosion ripped through the basin. It wasn't massive, not a fireball, no flames, just a thunderous, concussive burst from under the ground that threw half the team backwards and sent a surge of static screaming through the equipment. The transfer monitor went black. Sparks cascaded from the towers, and in the confusion, Cal moved.
He wasn't restrained. He hadn't even been touched. As the soldiers reeled, he launched forward with surgical efficiency, one clean strike to the nearest man's throat, a disarm, a twist of the wrist, and the rifle was his. The rest happened too fast for Rourke to track. In the span of 6 seconds, Cal dropped 3 of them, non-lethal takedowns, but devastating. He moved like a machine, like someone whose mind and body had been trained to synchronize under fire, to make decisions faster than most men could blink. The 7th soldier, the one at the data terminal, reached for his sidearm, but Cal was already there, disarming him with a brutal elbow to the temple and knocking him unconscious in a single fluid motion. He then crouched over the equipment, connected a small device to the open port, and waited. 5 seconds. 10. A green light blinked once. Whatever data they had tried to send, Cal had either intercepted it or erased it. Rourke realized then, this wasn't just a man trying to escape a mission gone wrong. Cal had returned with purpose. This was a surgical strike, not against the convoy, but against whatever they had come for. He wasn't here to fight them, he was here to protect what was buried. Then came the backup. 3 tilt-rotor aircraft roared overhead, low and fast, not marked, but unmistakably military. They dropped smoke canisters as they descended beyond the basin, kicking up clouds that blanketed the canyon in a whiteout haze. Rourke could no longer see clearly through the binoculars, but he heard it. The sound of gunfire, short bursts, precise. Then silence again. And then nothing. The smoke cleared slowly. The basin was empty. No bodies, no vehicles, no tents. Gone. Like none of it had happened. Rourke stared unblinking as the final curl of smoke drifted across the basin floor, and then standing alone in the center of the rock formation was Cal. He looked up toward the fire station tower, directly at Rourke, and nodded once. It wasn't acknowledgement, it wasn't farewell, it was confirmation. He had done what he came to do. Behind him, the ridge shimmered with faint residual heat, and the earth beneath his feet pulsed once, like something deep below had been put back to sleep, or sealed away for good. That night, the lights returned to Redcliff as if nothing had happened.
Phones buzzed back to life, power returned, signals normalized, but something fundamental had changed. Rourke knew it. The world above had blinked, and the world beneath had stirred. The next morning dawned with deceptive normalcy. Birds chirped over the rooftops, the sun painted the mesas with its usual golden hue, and the early risers in Redcliff moved about their routines with the faint relief that things seemed to be working again. The power stayed on, cell phones held their signals, no more drones buzzed over the canyons, no more blacked-out SUVs coasted down Main Street. The people who had sensed something dark beneath the surface now chose to pretend it had never happened. Redcliff had always preferred silence to confrontation. And after all, no one could prove anything. But Sheriff Rourke knew better. He had seen too much. More than that, he had felt it, something deep and ancient, something locked inside the land like a secret never meant to be unearthed. And he knew that Cal, wherever he was now, had been the only thing standing between that secret and the greedy hands of men who wouldn't stop until they broke it wide open. Rourke sat alone in his office, sipping cold coffee, the kind that tasted like ash after a night without sleep. Spread across his desk were all the pieces he had gathered, the photos, the surveillance sketches, the printouts of ownership transfers, the old military files he wasn't supposed to have. It all amounted to a puzzle with half its pieces burned. But one thing rang clear. The world he had served faithfully for decades was not as simple as he had once believed. The badge on his chest had no jurisdiction over the shadows that had passed through his town. There was a knock on his door. No one usually knocked this early. He stood slowly, resting his hand near the sidearm he now carried as second nature, and opened it to find a young man in a postal uniform, holding a box. No return address, no barcode, no tracking label, just his name handwritten on the top. When he reached for it, the courier didn't speak. He nodded once, turned, and walked down the steps without looking back. Inside the box was a device, sleek, metallic, no buttons or screens, just a single fingerprint reader and a red LED. Taped to the top was a note in blocky, all-capital handwriting. "You're owed the truth, only if you still want it." He pressed his thumb to the reader, a faint whir. The red light blinked green. The device clicked open, revealing a compact drive no larger than a pack of matches, plugged into a thin, ruggedized tablet already preloaded with encrypted data. He booted it up. What followed was an avalanche of classified files, redacted communiques, voice logs, tactical debriefings, and satellite footage, years of covert operations stretching across war zones the world never heard about, with teams that didn't exist on paper. Cal was in nearly all of them. In some, he was a footnote. In others, the central figure. But the most chilling entries weren't about Cal at all. They were about the capsule. Its official designation, Arc 9.
Recovered from deep beneath the earth in an uncharted region of Southeast Asia. Composition, unknown. No clear origin. The first team to make contact had suffered mass hallucinations, psychological deterioration, and in one case, complete neural collapse. It admitted no radiation, no heat, no light. But it could be felt. Not measured, not recorded, felt. It created impressions, like memories not your own, and more than once, those who touched it reported that it recognized them. The files went on to describe an internal debate at the highest levels, whether to bury it again or study it. Of course, study one. It was brought stateside, moved between sites, caged, scanned, prodded, but it never responded again until Cal. Rourke read the final log entry dated 7 months prior. A satellite in geosynchronous orbit had picked up a signal burst near a U.S. desert testing range. Frequency matched ArcIX's original pulse. Cal was dispatched not to extract the artifact, but to confirm it had reactivated. He went dark after that, officially classified as AWOL. Unofficially, he had become something else, the gatekeeper. Rourke leaned back, the truth heavy in his chest. This had never been about a man on the run. This had been about containment, about choices made by those too powerful to be questioned, and about one man who had seen what they were willing to do to own something that was never theirs. Later that day, Rourke took a slow drive out toward the basin. It was quiet again. No signs of the convoy. The ground had been scrubbed clean. But standing alone near the cliff's edge was a familiar figure. Cal. No bike this time,
Just him, still as a statue, gazing across the canyon like he was listening to something too far off for mortal ears. Rourke got out. No words passed between them for a long time. Then Cal spoke. He said he'd been part of things he'd never be able to explain. Missions that erased people, buried truths. And in the end, he'd come to see that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't power. It was the certainty of those who thought they deserved it. He told Rourke that what was buried under the basin wasn't a weapon or a machine. It was a memory, a fragment of something older than human history, something left behind not to be used, but to be remembered. He said the people who tried to take it would return. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for years, but they always came back, because that's what power does. It forgets the lessons it was taught. Rourke asked him why he'd warned him, why leave notes, why give him the truth. Cal answered without hesitation. He said authority didn't mean awareness, that titles and badges didn't make someone worthy of truth. But watching how Rourke had handled the unknown, quietly, humbly, without panic, told him that some people could still be trusted to carry a story without trying to control it. Before he left, Cal turned to him and said something Rourke would never forget. There's a difference between protecting people and hiding things from them. You chose the right side. And with that, he was gone, down the rocky path, swallowed once more by the desert. Rourke stood alone for a while, the wind picking up again, whispering through the canyons like voices from long ago. He didn't know where Cal had gone or if he'd ever return, but he did know this. The man he had once dismissed as a drifter had become his greatest teacher. And the lesson was simple. Respect isn't earned by rank or uniform. It's earned by what you do when no one's watching. Sheriff Rourke wasn't the same man anymore, and neither was Redcliff. You'd have to know what to look for to notice it. It wasn't in the storefronts or the polished windows or the church bells that rang every Sunday. It was in the weight people carried behind their smiles, the subtle caution in the way they walked to their cars at night, how they scanned the sky when a helicopter passed too low. The town had been touched by something it didn't have words for, and those who had felt it firsthand, the deputies, the witnesses, the survivors, were beginning to look at each other with different eyes. In the weeks that followed the incident, or whatever history would choose to call it, the official narrative slowly filtered in from the top. A Homeland Security operation had gone wrong. The FBI was monitoring a suspected terrorist cell in the Southwest. There had been an intelligence mix-up, and the military presence was explained as part of a high-level training exercise gone awry. The local media was paid off or silenced, and the few who dared to publish speculation online were quickly discredited, their footage pulled, their sources threatened. The cover-up was executed with surgical precision, bureaucratic enough to be believed, obscure enough to be forgotten, but not by Rourke, and not by the handful who had seen the black convoy with their own eyes. Deputy Alan Hines, the same rookie who had drawn his sidearm on Cal that first day and nearly escalated what could have been fatal, was now the most changed of all. Once brash and dismissive, he now walked slower, listened longer, and carried a small notebook in his back pocket filled with names, locations, and unexplained sightings. He had become the department's unofficial chronicler of the strange, not out of obsession, but out of duty. One afternoon, he walked into Rourke's office and laid a new file on his desk. Reports of hikers going missing in the salt flats beyond the basin, all near the perimeter of a no-fly zone that hadn't existed a month earlier. He didn't say anything else, just nodded, turned, and left. The silence between them was mutual understanding. The old days of laughing off conspiracy theories were over.
Even townsfolk who once rolled their eyes at the mention of Cal were now asking about him. The mechanic at the Redcliff auto stop, a tough woman named Lisbeth who'd once called Cal a glorified drifter with attitude, admitted to Rourke in private that she hadn't been able to stop thinking about the man's eyes, the way they'd swept over the tools on her wall and silently rearranged them in his mind, the way he'd seemed to anticipate when her air compressor would fail. She confessed she now carried a kind of guilt, not just for misjudging him, but for missing the chance to ask him who he really was. That same week, Rourke received an anonymous package at the station. It was unmarked and wrapped in old waxed paper, sealed with black twine.
Inside was a single item, an antique compass, the kind used by military scouts in the early 20th century. It was engraved on the back with two simple words: "For when the road forks." Rourke kept it in his pocket from that day on. But the transformation wasn't just individual. Something in the town's fabric had shifted. When a massive thunderstorm knocked out the power grid one night, no one panicked. Neighbors checked in on each other. Flashlights passed hand to hand. A retired ranger took up watch near the reservoir without being asked. The people had seen something too large for headlines, too real for rumor. And now, deep down, they all knew something more might come again. When it did, they intended to meet it together. Redcliff's high school began quietly incorporating new history materials, not in the main curriculum, but in an after-hours elective called Unexplained America. Students who once laughed at desert myths now asked serious questions. A mural was painted on the side of the local hardware store, showing a lone rider on a bike against a backdrop of lightning and mountains. At first glance, it looked like a tribute to Western wanderers, but locals knew. They knew who it was. As for Rourke, he didn't try to control the narrative. He stopped trying to explain away the unknown. Instead, he made room for it. He started holding quiet town hall meetings, not with PowerPoint slides or official briefings, but with a fire in the middle of the floor, and a rule: no questions are too strange. People came. They shared. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried. But through it all, Rourke reminded them of something deeper than policy, that respect begins where assumption ends. In one of the final meetings before the fall season, Rourke stood and read from a letter. He didn't say where it came from, but anyone listening understood. The words were simple. "We are only visitors here, all of us. The land doesn't belong to us, we belong to it. And some things buried aren't meant to be dug up, but remembered. That's how you keep balance. That's how you protect more than just borders. That's how you protect home." The room fell into reverent silence. No applause, just stillness. A collective breath shared by people who finally understood what it meant to be stewards of something unseen. Cal never returned to Redcliff, at least not in ways anyone could confirm, but the impact of his presence remained like a footprint in fresh cement, permanent and shaping. And those who once dismissed him had become his unexpected disciples, guardians of a lesson too important to lose again. The town that had once scoffed at the strange now stood watch over the silent, and the sheriff who had once cuffed a ghost now protected his legacy like sacred flame. Because when the day came that the horizon darkened again, and another convoy tried to cross that line in the sand, Redcliff would be ready, not with guns or sirens, but with memory. Memory of the man they stopped. The wrong motorcycle, the right reason. It had been nearly 2 months since the night the town lost power and Redcliff's world split along invisible seams. Though the lights came back on and the satellites resumed their quiet vigil, Sheriff Rourke often felt as though he were standing in two realities at once. One he could write reports about, and another that lived between the lines. Nothing had exploded, there had been no bodies, no official statement was made, and no headlines followed. But those who lived through it carried the weight of something far heavier than an incident. It wasn't trauma, not exactly. It was awareness, and awareness he'd come to understand never went away. It only deepened. Rourke drove alone now, more often than he used to. He told himself it was for patrol, that a visible presence kept the peace. But really he was searching. Not for answers anymore. He was looking for echoes, traces of the event. A pattern he couldn't name, but might recognize if he saw it again. Each morning before the town rose, he would fill his thermos, load his shotgun into the truck's floor mount, and head toward the desert basin where it had all begun. The road there was the same as ever. Dry scrub, rusted fences, a few coyotes that scattered when they heard the engine. But the land had changed. Not to the eye, perhaps, but something in the air was different. There were no birds near the canyon anymore. Not a single crow or hawk. The wind carried no calls. Even the insects had relocated. The silence wasn't just natural. It was enforced. The way a battlefield falls quiet after the last shot. Not out of peace, but memory. Near the canyon's edge, Rourke stepped out and surveyed the landscape with a deliberate caution he didn't used to have. A few years ago, he might have chuckled at the idea of sacred ground or energy lines, but now he kept his boots off certain patches of earth, not because he feared them, but because he respected them.
This was no longer just land. It was a marker, a place where two worlds had overlapped and then peeled away from each other, leaving behind a scar only some could see. On this particular morning, the sheriff noticed something he hadn't before. In the low dawn light, a glint of metal blinked from beneath a pile of sun-bleached rocks. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a cigarette lighter. He crouched and brushed the dust away carefully. What emerged was an oddly shaped key. Not a car key, not a padlock key. This was something else. It was flat, brushed titanium, and had markings etched in a language he didn't recognize. Or, rather, a language that didn't belong anywhere he could trace. He turned it over and saw a symbol on the back, a triangle intersected by a vertical line, like a compass bisected by a sword. His chest tightened. It was the same symbol he'd seen once before, on a patch sewn into the inside collar of Cal's jacket when they'd brought him in that first day. Back then, he hadn't thought anything of it, just some military insignia from an old op. Now he knew better. Symbols mattered, especially ones not meant to be recognized. He slipped the key into his pocket and stood, instinctively glancing around. The desert remained still, but something told him he just triggered a signal, a silent alarm not meant for people like him. That night, he didn't sleep. 2 days later, the first reports started coming in. Livestock missing from the western farms. Not killed, not even signs of blood, just gone. Fences intact, gates locked, no footprints, no vehicle tracks, just an absence. Then came the drone failures. Locals who flew recreational drones near the basin reported strange shutdowns, complete loss of control, like something in the air had shorted out their frequencies. Then the dogs started acting up, barking into corners, refusing to enter certain rooms, growling at places they used to sleep without fear. The town's rhythm had broken, and Rourke knew why. He didn't need to contact anyone. He didn't need to file a report. He simply went to the old ranger's tower on the northeast ridge, one of the last places with a clear line of sight into the canyon, and, more importantly, where the signal interference was weakest. From there, he placed the call, not to the FBI, not to Homeland, not to any agency he had a direct number for. He used the satellite phone Cal had left hidden behind the false wall in the firehouse garage, the one nobody else knew about, the one with a single contact marked only by coordinates and a code word. He entered both, then waited. It took 4 minutes. The line buzzed once. Then a voice answered, low and clear, as if it had been waiting for him. "Sheriff, you found the key." It wasn't Cal's voice, but it was connected to him. Rourke could hear it in the tone, in the authority that wasn't brash, but ancient. Whoever was speaking wasn't surprised. They'd known this day would come. Rourke didn't waste time with introductions. He explained the livestock, the symbols, the silence returning to the basin. The voice gave only one reply. Then the seal didn't hold. Rourke's blood ran cold, not from fear, but from the confirmation. This wasn't about men in uniforms or rogue black sites. It wasn't about data transfers or even the convoy. This was about something far older. Older than Delta. Older than nations. Cal had delayed it, maybe even buried it, but not forever. The sheriff ended the call and looked out toward the ridge where the rock formations cast long shadows across the dirt. For a moment, he swore he saw a figure standing there. Not moving, not watching, just present. He didn't blink, he didn't raise his weapon. He just whispered one thing under his breath. Not again. And turned back toward the town. Because Redcliff wasn't just a town anymore. It was a fault line, and something beneath it was shifting again. The late autumn winds swept down from the high ridge like ghosts returning to unfinished business, coiling through Redcliff's empty alleys and bending the brittle grass along the canyon's edge. Sheriff Rourke stood outside the old ranger station, his boots planted firm in the red dust, his eyes scanning the horizon not for motion, but for shift. The kind of shift that didn't show itself through movement, but how the weight in the air changed, how the birds kept their distance, and even the rocks seemed to lean a fraction differently beneath the sun. It had been a week since the voice on the satellite phone confirmed his worst fear. The seal hadn't held. Whatever Cal and his kind had been containing wasn't gone. It had just been sleeping. Now, something was waking up. In the days since the call, the town's already strained atmosphere had turned electric, and not in the metaphorical sense. Electronic equipment began behaving oddly. Phones refused to hold charge, radios caught bursts of static that sounded like language, though no one could quite decipher the tone. Car alarms went off for no reason. Motion sensors blinked when nothing was there. It wasn't just mechanical malfunction, it was interference, like something was breathing beneath the circuit boards, pushing its presence into the edges of human tech. And then, on a gray morning just before sunrise, the motorcycle returned. It wasn't loud. In fact, it didn't make a sound. No engine growl, no gravel crunch beneath the tires, just the sudden awareness of something present where nothing had been before. The bike appeared outside the firehouse, parked beneath the same rusted flagpole that still bore the scorch mark from the helicopter's backdraft weeks ago. It was black, matte, and unadorned. But it wasn't the same bike from before.
It was sleeker now, with no license plate, no reflective markings, no visible fuel intake. It looked less like a machine and more like a creature that had chosen to disguise itself as one. Rourke arrived first. He didn't rush, he didn't call for backup. He stepped from his cruiser and approached the rider, who stood beside the motorcycle like a sentinel returned to his post. The man didn't move at first. He wore the same armored jacket as before, but the helmet was different. Fully enclosed, black as oil, with no visor, just a smooth, reflective surface that distorted the world around it, like a mirror submerged underwater. Then the helmet lifted, slow and deliberate, and Rourke saw the face of a man he knew, but not as he remembered. Cal's eyes were the same, steely gray, hard as spent shell casings, but something behind them had changed. The old calm was still there, but now it bore the gravity of someone who had crossed a line too distant for return. There was no welcome in his expression, no recognition of shared history, only confirmation, as if to say, "It's time." Rourke didn't speak at first, neither did Cal. The silence between them was not awkward or tense, it was reverent. Eventually, the sheriff asked what needed to be asked. Did it get out? Cal's answer was quiet, not whispered, just measured. Not all the way, but it's trying, and it's not alone anymore. The words didn't make sense, not to the rational mind, but Rourke wasn't listening with the rational part of himself anymore. He was listening with instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive in places most men never survived. He'd trusted it when the sky cracked open weeks ago, when the convoy vanished, when the silence settled like ash over the basin. He trusted it now. He motioned toward the town. They're starting to notice. Cal nodded once. They'll notice more soon. Patterns are fracturing. It starts small, power surges, animal behavior, light distortion. Then come the mimicries. That's when it gets dangerous. Rourke didn't need clarification. The mimicries. He'd already heard the reports. People seeing loved ones who weren't there, hearing their voices in static. One farmer swore he had seen his dead son standing at the edge of the field at twilight, wearing the same shirt he was buried in. Another woman said her dog came home with 2 shadows. The sheriff exhaled heavy and steady. What do you need? Cal looked up past the rooftops, past the mountains, past something unseen. He need what you've been hiding. It hit Rourke like a punch to the gut. The key, the strange, etched sliver of metal he'd found near the canyon, the symbol burned into its back. He hadn't told anyone, not even Hines. But Cal had known. Of course he had. The man didn't guess. He remembered. Always. Rourke handed it over. Cal took it without thanks, but not without weight. His fingers wrapped around it like it was the final part of a puzzle
only he had been entrusted to complete. Then he walked past the sheriff and mounted the bike in one fluid motion. Rourke stepped back. "Where are you going?" he asked. Cal responded without looking back. "Below." And then he was gone. No engine, no roar, just a shift in light as the bike vanished down the road that led toward the canyon, the same road that had once been a boundary line. Now it was a path into something far deeper. That night, Redcliff slept uneasily. The wind howled through narrow streets. Street lamps flickered like candles before a storm. And beneath the surface, in the chambers no map dared mark, a lock began to turn. The man beneath the helmet was no longer just a drifter, no longer just a soldier. He was a sentinel, a guardian, a gatekeeper. And the gate was opening. The first time Cal rode down into the gulch, he'd been just another pair of boots on a classified recon team. Back then, it was all coordinates and protocols, readings and radiation masks, a mission born of worry and data spikes buried in military servers. Now, as his tires bit into the red canyon clay and spiraled down through the narrow passage toward what lay hidden beneath Redcliff, he wasn't just returning, he was reliving something the rest of the world had forgotten, or rather, something they had agreed never to remember. The seal was a compromise, a desperate effort between science and violence, between men who understood too much and men who wanted to understand nothing. That compromise had held for years, until human curiosity pried at its edges and something ancient stirred behind it. The key in Cal's jacket pulsed faintly, not with any visible light, but with a kind of warmth, a resonance that Cal could feel against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The deeper he rode, the more the canyon changed. Natural rock gave way to smoother walls, almost metallic in their texture, but grown from the earth like bone instead of forged like steel. Vines that weren't really vines clung to the walls, filament-like tendrils that shimmered subtly in the shadows, breathing in slow, synchronized waves. And though no sunlight reached this deep, there was light, faint blue like bioluminescence, pulsing from unseen sources embedded in the rock, like the planet itself was trying to warn him away. But Cal didn't stop. He knew what waited. The path opened into a chamber he hadn't seen in over a decade. Time hadn't touched it. No dust, no degradation, no collapse. It was as though entropy had made a pact to leave this place alone. At the center of the space stood the structure, half temple, half machine, rising from the floor like a monument to forgotten science.
Smooth black spires arced upward in a spiral, surrounding a platform that hummed faintly, not audibly, but within the bones. To most, it would seem alien, but Cal knew it wasn't. It was older than alien. It was terrestrial, just not from this version of Earth. A relic from before the layers of history settled, from a cycle lost and buried before humanity ever stood upright. He stepped off the bike, his boots echoing with a sound that didn't match the motion. Every footfall triggered tiny pulses across the chamber walls, waves of awareness, like sonar bouncing back and whispering, "He's here." At the center of the platform, the seal waited. It was the size of a manhole cover, set into the ground, etched with the same triangle and vertical line that marked the key. The metal shimmered like mercury caught in mid-freeze, solid yet fluid. Cal knelt beside it, producing the key and aligning it with a depression that hadn't been visible until he'd arrived. It fit, not like a puzzle, but like a ritual, a fulfillment. Something clicked, not with a sound, but with a presence, as if the chamber had inhaled. The seal began to part. It didn't open with hinges or collapse with weight. It simply retracted inward, folding like light into a space that wasn't there before. From the opening, a current of air escaped, dry but laced with a smell Cal hadn't breathed since that last mission. Iron, ozone,
and something impossible to name, like petrichor from a world that never rained. Below, stairs spiraled downward into a shaft that bent light itself. There was no shadow, but also no clear direction of illumination. Every step seemed to absorb and reflect in equal measure. He descended, slowly at first, then faster, as if something in him recognized this descent not as danger, but as duty. What waited at the bottom wasn't a chamber. It was a void, with structure, a space not meant to exist, yet somehow here. Structures floated, not suspended, but disconnected from gravity altogether, geometry that bent as he looked at it, then reformed when he looked away. And in the center of it all stood the containment unit. It was cracked. Hairline at first glance, but unmistakable. The pressure field around it was destabilizing. What had once been a humming sphere of static equilibrium was now twitching, pulsing in uneven bursts like a dying heart. Inside, something moved, not violently, not dramatically, but with intention, awareness. Cal approached the console, a series of touch-responsive surfaces that responded to both biometric input and what could only be described as will. He laid his hand on the interface, and a series of pulses acknowledged him. The system remembered, and worse, it confirmed. The containment was failing. He initiated the protocols, not the shutdowns. That wouldn't work now. The failsafes had eroded too far, but there was still one option left. Not a fix, not a reset, a channeling, a rebinding. It was forbidden even among his former unit. They'd all agreed, if it came to this, it would require a volunteer, a sacrifice. Someone to become the new interface, the living seal. The chamber asked the question silently, not in words, but in posture, in temperature, in the sudden pause of motion all around him. Would he bind it again? Cal didn't hesitate. He activated the transference. Above, back in Redcliff, the sky flickered for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for satellites to log an anomaly. Long enough for every dog in town to howl. Long enough for Rourke to stand from his desk and look out the window toward the canyon, knowing exactly what had just happened. Below, Cal felt the interface embrace him. Not physically, not even spiritually, but in memory. His life played back, not in moments, but in patterns. Regret, duty, anger, resolve. The system mapped him like a terrain. Then, it accepted him. The unit sealed. The chamber stabilized. But Cal was no longer just Cal. He was the lock now. The gatekeeper made manifest. And the world, though it would never know, had just been spared. For now. The morning after the stabilization, Redcliff awoke to a silence that felt unnaturally clean, as if every sound had been filtered through cotton and sent back muffled by a force that didn't understand how the world was supposed to hum. Birds didn't chirp, trucks didn't start, even the distant thrum of highway noise seemed to have been swallowed by the earth. For the first time in days, none of the town's electronics glitched, no alarms cried wolf, no dogs barked at unseen things just beyond fences, and yet, somehow, everyone felt more uneasy, not less. Like the pressure had dropped and a storm had passed without rain, but left behind an atmosphere charged with static dread. Sheriff Rourke stood alone on the ridge overlooking the canyon. He'd driven out before sunrise, drawn by instinct more than logic, as if some unspoken tether pulled him back to where Cal had vanished into the earth. He hadn't heard from him. No one had. The motorcycle was gone. The satellite line that had once routed through Cal's Black Ops network had gone dead. But Rourke wasn't there to make calls. He was there to feel something.
to witness whatever change had happened beneath their feet. What he saw disturbed him more than he expected. The ground above the hidden facility, where once there had been a subtle, almost imperceptible hill, was now smooth. Too smooth. Like a scar that healed without a wound. The contours of the land had shifted slightly, unnaturally, as if the canyon itself had taken a deep breath and held it. Rourke walked to the center of the flattened zone and knelt, placing a hand against the red soil. It was warm. Not sun-warmed. This was different. This was residual energy, like stepping near the back of a running server room.
He stayed there a moment, breathing slowly, unsure whether to feel grateful or afraid. Whatever had happened below had sealed something shut. But something inside him also knew it had not been destroyed, just managed. He rose and turned back toward town, his boots kicking up dust in a place that had long since stopped being natural. And as he drove down the canyon trail, a new kind of tension took root in his chest, because above ground, other forces had begun to move. That same morning, over 600 miles away at a deep airstrip Delta facility known only to a handful of men with clearance above top secret, alarms began to register fluctuations in the Redcliff data node. Not threats, not breaches, not aggression, just change. Stabilization following anomalous collapse. That in itself wasn't alarming. What set the sirens wailing through the hardened command room was that the biometric lock on the containment unit had been overridden, not externally, but internally, by one of their own. Cal Shepard's clearance code had activated after 13 years of dormancy. Inside the command center, men in plain gray uniforms scrambled between terminals while holograms mapped the anomaly's impact. General Braddock, a man who'd signed more denial reports than field orders in the last 5 years, stood still, arms folded, eyes fixed on the rotating digital topography of Redcliff's canyon. He didn't speak for a long time. Not until the lead analyst cleared his throat and muttered the only words that mattered. "Sir? It's him." Braddock nodded once. "Confirm life status." The analyst hesitated. "Unclear. Vital signals consistent with baseline human life, but integrated into the containment field. We can't separate readings. Whatever Cal did, he's a part of it now." Braddock said nothing. He only stared deeper into the map, as if trying to make out the shape of a ghost beneath the terrain. He'd been there the day they first opened that gate. He'd seen what the containment unit held. He knew, better than anyone, that it wasn't just a biological anomaly or interdimensional fracture. It was a will, a conscious force bound by design and desperate for purpose. And now one of their own had merged with it. He turned to the aide beside him. "Get me the town's sheriff." That call reached Rourke's desk an hour later, and though the satellite line was encrypted and scrambled 5 times through defense networks, the voice on the other end was unmistakably Braddock's. There was no formality, no greeting. "He did it, didn't he?" Braddock asked, his voice stripped of bureaucratic polish. Rourke responded with a tired sigh. "Yeah." He went below, took the key, the energy readings dropped. "He hasn't come back up." "Then he made the bind." Braddock's tone was more grim than grateful. "He shouldn't have. That protocol was closed." Rourke rubbed his temples. "He didn't care about your protocols. You know that. He saw the cracks. He acted. Silence followed. Heavy and long. Then Braddock said something Rourke didn't expect. "We need to go in." Rourke bristled. "Go in? Are you out of your mind? You think sending another team's gonna help now? He sealed it. He became the lock." "We don't need to interfere. We just need to understand what he became. His mind may still be reachable. There are layers in that chamber we never mapped. He may be able to communicate from the inside." "And if you prod him too hard? What if you break the seal from your side?"
Braddock didn't answer. Because they both knew what would happen. The containment wasn't just physical, it was willed. It required someone capable of suppressing the entity's mimetic reach, its ability to imprint and multiply across neurological patterns. Cal hadn't just been a soldier, he'd been trained, modified even, to act as a firewall against an idea that could infect minds like a virus. If he was compromised, or broken by interrogation, or pulled out against his will, then what had been sealed wouldn't just escape, it would replicate. Rourke hung up without permission, staring out the window at the canyon once again. A shiver crawled down his spine. He thought about the mimicries, the flickers in the air, the way memory could be weaponized by a force that fed on thought itself. Then he whispered a quiet prayer. Not for Cal, but for anyone foolish enough to try and open that gate again. The storm that had passed over Redcliff in silence left behind more than just confusion. It left traces. There were brief glimmers of static on radios that hadn't worked in years, flickers of synchronized heartbeat pulses detected in unrelated devices, and security cameras looping on fragments of footage that had never been recorded. These weren't glitches. They were remnants. Footprints of something too vast to move cleanly through the world, like an aircraft carrier slipping through a shallow stream. And within these digital scars, a message began to surface. At first, it was mistaken for corruption, just a jumble of symbols and static noise embedded in the satellite feedback. But pattern recognition algorithms at the Delta facility started mapping it out. Not random, not artificial. Intentional. And painfully human. The message was simple: I am still here. But it was buried beneath layers of encoding that only one man could have devised. The cipher traced back to Cal's early encryption signatures years before he left the service. And each layer wasn't just technical, it was personal. One required a timestamp from a forgotten mission in Uzbekistan. Another demanded the coordinates of the first safe house Cal ever built. And one, cryptically, was a quote from a children's book his sister used to read to him when he was 10 years old. Cal realized quickly that this wasn't just a signal. It was a test. Cal was reaching out, but only to those who truly understood him.
Only to those who'd earned the right to speak with him. Because where he now existed, comprehension was dangerous. Even thinking about the entity too clearly could invite it into your mind. This was no longer about secrecy. This was about containment by thought. Meanwhile, the town of Redcliff tried to pretend nothing had changed. The sheriff's department fielded dozens of inquiries a day, mostly conspiracy theorists and independent journalists who picked up the energy readings online. No one got close. Federal presence wasn't official, but it was absolute. Black SUVs with plates that didn't exist, men with no name tags, eyes always behind mirrored lenses, and no sense of humor. Whatever Redcliff had become, it was no longer an American town, it was a buffer zone, a breathing firewall. And Sheriff Rourke, the only man on the ground who actually knew what had happened, found himself walking a tightrope every day between truth and silence. He visited the canyon ridge every morning now. Sometimes he spoke aloud. Not because he believed Cal could hear him, but because he needed to remember. He told stories, mundane ones, about the diner burning its eggs, about the mayor's failed proposal to host a tourist rodeo, about the new mechanic in town who never smiled but fixed everything with perfect precision. They were offerings, words of a world still ticking, still alive. It made him feel like Cal hadn't disappeared. Like maybe he was listening. Then, one night, he wasn't alone. Rourke had parked his cruiser at the base of the ridge and walked the trail with a flashlight when the beam caught something metallic higher up the path. At first, he assumed it was just scrap, leftover tech from the cleanup. But as he climbed closer, the light revealed something unmistakable. A motorcycle. Sleek, matte black, engine still faintly humming. The same motorcycle Cal had ridden into town on the day this all began. Rourke froze. His heart thudded against his ribs like a caged bird. No one else could have ridden that bike. It had been fingerprint-coded, AI sequenced to Cal's biometric signatures, unwritable to anyone else. But there it was, resting casually, like it had never left. He circled it cautiously. No footprints, no tire marks, just the bike. Then the visor lifted. He didn't see a face, not right away, just a flicker, like light bending around something it couldn't comprehend. And then, slowly, steadily, it coalesced. It was Cal, or a version of him. The features were the same, strong jaw, eyes with a weight too heavy for their sockets, but the presence was different. Less grounded, like the space around him was fighting to remember what a human was supposed to look like. Rourke didn't speak. He couldn't. Not because he was afraid, but because something about the moment demanded silence. Reverence. Finally, Cal broke it. "I don't have long." His voice was distorted slightly, like it was being played through a frequency just outside the normal range of hearing. Rourke nodded, swallowing the dry knot in his throat. "Are you alive?" he finally asked. Cal tilted his head. "Define alive." That wasn't helpful, but also it wasn't to know. "I had to resurface, only for a moment. I left something behind. It's in the old safe house. You'll know what to do when you see it." Rourke blinked. Why me? Cal's gaze didn't waver. "Because you never asked the wrong questions." Then the visor closed, and the bike roared to life without a key, without touch. Rourke stepped back, shielding his eyes as the headlights flooded the ridge trail. The engine didn't roar like it used to. It sang, a deep, harmonious hum that resonated through the trees and down into the earth, like some sacred instrument tuning itself to the world. And just like that, Cal was gone again. The next morning, Rourke drove to the old safe house on the edge of town. It was abandoned, half buried in pine needles and erosion. No one had lived there in years. He stepped inside, brushing past spider webs and memories. The air was dry, heavy with dust, and a kind of stillness that felt too deliberate. He checked every drawer, every compartment. Nothing. Until he found the mirror. A tall, oval-shaped antique leaning against the back wall, covered with a tarp. When he pulled it back, he didn't see his own reflection. He saw footage. From the facility. From the inside. A live feed. It wasn't a mirror. It was a window. And what it showed made his blood freeze. Cal was there, sitting, cross-legged in a massive chamber that pulsed with color and motion and impossible geometry. And around him, hundreds of versions of himself. Echoes. Some younger, some older, all identical, all watching. The entity hadn't just been bound, it had been mirrored. And the man who stopped it became the keeper of its reflections. Sheriff Rourke didn't sleep that night. Not even a blink. After leaving the safe house, he locked himself in his office and stared at his reflection in the blackened monitor screen long after he'd shut the power off. Not because he expected to see something else looking back, but because part of him feared he already had. The images in the antique mirror hadn't faded from memory. If anything, they had deepened. More than anything he'd ever witnessed in his years on the force, the sight of Cal surrounded by those mirrored selves, those watching, breathing echoes, had shattered what little framework he'd left for understanding the world. What haunted him most wasn't the technology or the impossible depth of the mirror. It was Cal's stillness. Not fear, not resolve,
but stillness, as if he were holding something back or guarding something in. Rourke didn't know which frightened him more.
By dawn, he made his way through the administrative layers that were now spread invisibly over Redcliff. The town hadn't just been occupied, it had been quietly turned into a data capsule. Drone relays tucked into street lamps, sound sensors hidden behind schoolyard fences, frequency scrambling netting threaded through power lines. It was like living inside a nervous system designed to monitor every breath the town took. And somehow, despite all that control, none of it had noticed Cal's return the night before. Or maybe they had, and chose not to act. He entered the hidden underground facility again for the first time since the aftermath. They'd tried to keep him out. The agents weren't fond of a local sheriff snooping around classified zones, no matter how crucial he'd been during the event, but Rourke had leverage they didn't understand. He was the only one Cal had trusted, and at this point, no protocol could override that. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked past the security desk, through the decontamination hallway, and into the observation floor that overlooked the containment chamber. Except now, the chamber was gone. The reinforced walls had been stripped down to framework, the energy vaults dismantled, the suspended ring platforms that once held the biofrequency locks had been removed. It was like it had never existed. A hollow space remained, humming faintly with the absence of something too large to stay forgotten. A technician noticed him and stiffened, unsure whether to sound the alarm. Rourke raised a hand in a slow, calm gesture and asked only one question. "Where is the reflection tech?" The technician blinked. What reflection tech? They didn't know, or had been told to forget. Either way, the silence was louder than denial. Back in town, something had shifted. The air felt denser, like it carried weight. Not weather, not atmosphere. Awareness. People walked a little more quickly, doors closed more softly, conversations ended mid-thought. Not out of fear, but out of instinct, like animals sensing a coming quake. And for the first time in days, Rourke noticed birds had returned to the skies over Redcliff. Dozens, maybe hundreds, circling, settling in trees, calling to each other like messengers sent to verify the balance of something unseen. Later that evening, Rourke received a package. No return address, no postmark, just a box wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax. Inside, a single item, a notebook, leather-bound, handwritten. He flipped it open and immediately recognized the writing, Cal's. The first page held a phrase, "If you're reading this, I've managed to stay conscious." Below it, a symbol, the same sigil that had once appeared on the floor of the containment chamber when the entity first emerged. Only now it was surrounded by annotations, cross-referenced with language families, mythologies, even waveform patterns. The pages that followed detailed Cal's descent, not into madness, but into multiplicity. He wrote about the Watcher, but not as an adversary, as a mirror, a being so fundamentally recursive it had no fixed form, only reflections of those who perceived it. He described how once contained, the Watcher didn't resist, it adapted, learned. It began to communicate, not with words, but with versions of Cal, drawn from timelines where he'd made different choices. Some had stayed in the army, others had never joined. Some had families. One had died at age 17. All of them were fragments of what the Watcher believed humanity to be, and it had chosen Cal because he was consistent across nearly every version. A man who protected without prejudice, who questioned but never wavered, who stood still in the face of what others ran from. The final entry was brief. "I am not its prisoner. I am its translator." That was when Rourke understood. Cal hadn't returned to warn them, he'd returned to complete a loop. Something had been left undone. An echo, not yet closed. The mirror in the safe house was not a broadcast, it was a lens, attuned to a specific kind of perception. And now that Rourke had seen through it,
He was part of that echo too. He drove back to the ridge where it all began. This time, there was no bike, no hum in the trees, just silence. He walked to the edge where the rock gave way to air and looked out over the canyon. The stars above were clearer than he'd ever seen them, burning sharp and deliberate. Then, out of the silence, a pulse. Not sound, not light, perception. Something like a breath taken across dimensions. And in that moment, Rourke didn't see Cal. He felt him, as if a part of the man had embedded itself in the world, watching not from above or below, but from within. And with that realization, a door opened. Not physically, but in understanding. The world hadn't been saved. It had been rewritten, recalibrated, to accommodate something once thought unthinkable. The Watcher wasn't just a threat. It was a witness. And Cal, the man on the motorcycle, had become its guide. By the time Sheriff Rourke returned to Redcliff, the world felt eerily calibrated, like the town had been gently nudged a few inches off from what it once was. Not changed in a way most people would notice, no. Kids still rode bikes past the hardware store. Mrs. Lang still opened her bakery every morning at 5:30 sharp, but there was a collective quiet beneath the rhythm of daily life now, a hush, in the pauses between footsteps and streetlights flickering. It wasn't silence out of fear. It was reverence, like the town knew something had passed through it, something old, something watching, and that something had worn the face of a man they tried to stop.
Cal Raleigh was gone. Not vanished, not buried, just absent. Like the final note of a song that you couldn't remember how to hum, but whose weight still lingered in your chest long after. Delta Force had retrieved the last of his files from the decommissioned safe house, classified every trace of the containment mirror, and scrubbed any evidence of the resonance chamber from their records. But Sheriff Rourke knew better than to believe in clean endings. What had occurred wasn't something you could erase. Not really. You could redact it from paper, sure, but you couldn't remove it from the shape of the world. In the weeks that followed, strange incidents began to surface across the country, reports of individuals describing seeing copies of themselves during moments of crisis. Not hallucinations, not mirror tricks. Verified doubles observed by witnesses caught in security footage that the government swiftly confiscated. These events didn't spark panic, though. If anything, they sparked something else. Questions. Deep, primal questions about time, choice, and consequence. But in Redcliff, things stayed quiet. Almost too quiet. Rourke kept his patrols going like clockwork. Same routes, same coffee breaks. But his eyes were always scanning reflections. Window panes, puddles, the glint off a rearview mirror. Not out of paranoia, out of habit. Because once you've seen the shape of something impossible, you start looking for it everywhere. And sometimes when he was alone in the station at night, he'd feel it. That slight shift in the air, like someone else had entered the room without opening a door. A presence that didn't move, didn't breathe, just observed. He wasn't afraid of it anymore. One afternoon, weeks after the incident, Rourke received another package. This one came by hand, delivered by a young woman on a blacked-out motorcycle with no plates. She wore a jacket with an insignia Rourke didn't recognize, a minimalist geometric symbol that shifted subtly as the fabric caught light. She handed him the small parcel, nodded once, and left without a word. The bike barely made a sound as it vanished over the ridge. Inside the package was a single item, a coin. Not currency, something older. It looked forged rather than minted, with edges worn from time and an engraving of two interlocking shapes, one a human eye, the other a mirror. On the back was a single word, etched clean and deep. Witness. That night, the stars above Redcliff pulsed with a kind of clarity Rourke had never seen. Not just brightness, intention. Like they were waiting.
He stood outside his house, holding the coin, staring at the constellations until his thoughts quieted. He didn't know where Cal had gone. He didn't know whether he was man, memory, or something else entirely now. But he knew this. Cal Raleigh hadn't run from the Watcher. He'd made himself a bridge to it. And in doing so, he hadn't just saved Redcliff. He'd reframed it. What had started as a mistaken traffic stop, a man on a motorcycle pulled over for riding too fast, had spiraled into the exposure of something buried deep in the folds of reality. And somehow, impossibly, the quiet man with the storm-worn jacket had navigated it without fury, without vengeance, with only the weight of knowledge and the choice to bear it alone. The town never heard from Delta Force again. Their temporary facility dissolved within days. The agents vanished as quietly as they had come. Even the Department of Defense refused to acknowledge the operation, leaving only whispers behind. But Rourke understood the real ending hadn't been the cleanup. It was the change in perception. People in Redcliff began noticing things. Not just minor glitches or shadows, but each other. Small acts of attention. Strangers helping without being asked. Neighbors watching out for one another like threads pulled closer in a tapestry. It was as if the town had absorbed some of Cal's presence, his stillness, his awareness, and integrated it. Not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. That anyone, even the most dismissed, might be a guardian of something vast and invisible. And though no one spoke of the incident openly, the story began to spread in a different form. Barstool tales, campfire whispers, the biker who walked out of the storm, the mirror that held 1,000 selves, the force that followed. A myth in the making. They never said his name, but they remembered the lesson. Don't judge by appearances. Don't underestimate stillness. Don't mistake silence for absence. Because sometimes the man you pull over isn't just a stranger passing through town. He might be the only thing standing between you and a reality too vast to survive alone. And when the world begins to fracture, when the Watcher stirs again, he'll be back. Not as a soldier, not even as a man, but as the one who rides between worlds. And he won't be alone.